10 million Russians handed their money to one man. Within 6 months, most of them had nothing left. In 1994, Russia was a country trying to learn capitalism almost overnight. The Soviet Union had collapsed 3 years earlier. State-owned factories were being sold off. Ordinary people were being handed vouchers and told, for the first time in their lives, that they could own a piece of something. Nobody really knew what a share was. Nobody really knew what a market was. And into that confusion walked Sergei Mavrodi. Mavrodi wasn't a banker. He wasn't a financier. He had run a small computer import business and had a history of tax troubles with the Russian government. He was quiet, awkward in public, and almost deliberately uncharismatic. None of that mattered. What he had was a television set and enough money to buy airtime on every major channel in Russia. And what he did with that airtime changed the country forever. MMM launched its advertising campaign in early 1994, and there has arguably never been anything like it in the history of financial fraud. The ads didn't promise returns. They didn't show graphs. They showed a fictional ordinary Russian named Lyanya Golubkov, a simple man in a flat cap, who bought MMM shares, made money, bought his wife boots, then a fur coat, then dreamed of traveling to America to watch a football game. The ads were funny. They were warm. They felt like they were made for people who had never been invited to participate in wealth before. And suddenly here was something that was. Russians didn't just watch the ads. They loved them. Lyanya Golubkov became a national celebrity. People stopped Mavrodi's actors on the street. The mechanics of MMM were straightforward, and Mavrodi made almost no attempt to hide them. There were no real underlying investments. The company didn't buy stocks or bonds or property. It bought its own shares back at higher and higher prices, funded entirely by the money coming in from new investors. The price of an MMM share rose from 600 rubles in February 1994 to over 105,000 rubles by July. That is a gain of roughly 127 times in 6 months. If you had put in the equivalent of a month's salary in February and sold in June, you would have made more money than most Russians earned in a decade. Some people did exactly that. They told their neighbors. Their neighbors told their families. An estimated 10 million people bought in. At the peak, MMM offices across Russia were processing tens of thousands of transactions a day. People queued around the block. Pensioners came with their life savings in cash. Factory workers pooled their wages. There were reports of people selling their apartments to buy shares. The Russian government issued warnings. Mavrodi responded by taking out more television ads, this time telling viewers that the government was simply jealous and trying to suppress the people's chance at wealth. The warnings made the queues longer. Here is where it gets worse. In late July 1994, Russian tax police raided MMM headquarters in Moscow. They were not investigating the scheme itself at that point. They were pursuing an older tax case. But the raid spooked the market. Mavrodi announced a temporary suspension of share buybacks. The price, which had been climbing for 6 months on pure momentum, stopped. Then it began to fall. By the first week of August, it had lost the majority of its value. People who had arrived at the offices to sell their shares found the doors closed. The money was gone. The collapse wasn't quiet. Russian media began reporting suicides within days. At least 50 deaths were allegedly linked to MMM losses by contemporaneous Russian press accounts, though the precise number was never formally established. Pensioners who had converted every asset they owned into MMM shares had nothing. People who had borrowed money to invest had debts they couldn't pay. A country that had just been told capitalism was freedom had its first enormous lesson in what unregulated markets could do. Mavrodi's response was, by any measure, one of the most audacious moves in the history of financial crime. He ran for parliament. He ran specifically from a constituency in Mytishchi, outside Moscow, and he won. Under Russian law at the time, a sitting member of the Duma couldn't be prosecuted. Immunity was automatic. He had allegedly defrauded 10 million people and then used the anger of his victims as a political platform, because many of them still believed he would somehow pay them back if he stayed free. He served in the Duma until 1995, when Parliament voted to strip him of his mandate. He was arrested the following year. The legal proceedings took over a decade. Mavrodi was convicted in 2007 on fraud charges. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, and because he had already spent time in pretrial detention, he was released relatively quickly. The losses to investors were never fully calculated. Estimates ranged into the billions of dollars. Almost nothing was ever recovered. The people who had queued around the block in 1994 received no restitution. What happened next is, in some ways, the most disturbing part of the story. Mavrodi didn't stop. In 2011, he launched Global, a new pyramid scheme, this time targeting developing markets including India, China, South Africa, and countries across Southeast Asia. He was explicit about what it was. He wrote on his own website that was a financial pyramid, and that people should only invest what they could afford to lose. Millions of people joined anyway. He launched further variants until his death from a heart attack in Moscow in March 2018. He was 60 years old. He died, by most accounts, with very little money of his own. There is a pattern in every scheme this channel has examined, and traces it more clearly than almost any other. The product wasn't shares. The product wasn't returns. The product was the feeling of being included. Russia in 1994 was full of people who had spent their entire lives being told that wealth wasn't for them, that the economy was a system they participated in but didn't own. Mavrodi gave them a story in which they were the protagonists, in which a man in a flat cap could buy his wife a fur coat, and the story was so good that 10 million people paid for it with real money. The autopsy finding is this: the most dangerous financial instruments aren't the complicated ones. They are the ones that make you feel, for the first time, that you deserve to win. That feeling is almost always the product. The returns are just the packaging, and by the time the packaging comes off, the exits are usually already closed.